But you would have missed the
You would, yeah.
Yeah, the
casserole,
handouts,
you
the
would've missed it.
the casserole and the handouts are not at home. So
And the great fellowship.
yes. Good morning, everybody. Today we are going to be looking at the question: how do we read the Old Testament? Just before we begin, just a heads up, this is going to be drinking from a fire hose. So there's going to be a lot of information here, which is why you have the handouts. There's a lot of stuff that you can go back to later. That's very intentional. There will be things in there that we will not go over. So feel free to go back and go through that. And then also I had one other thing that I wanted to say, and I don't remember what that was. So apparently it was not that important when it comes up. One of the things that, so I grew up, hold on, here we go. Talked about this a little bit. I haven't grown up completely. That's part of the problem. So I shared this a little bit at our last workshop. My wife did ask, do we need to have been to this last workshop to know what we're talking about today? Basically, no. It builds off of it, but I'm doing it in such a way where it's okay if you didn't. But at the last workshop, one of the things that I did share, though, is that for the first 30 plus years of my life, I really didn't know what to do with the Old Testament. It wasn't preached on much where we went to church, even when my dad was preaching. And when it was typically stories about, this person here, or that person there, or I'd get the flannel graph or the coloring page about this person here or that person there. And so as I got older and as I grew as a follower of Jesus, and I eventually dipped my toes into the Old Testament, I didn't really know too much about it. And frankly, I didn't even know how to read it. And so parts of it kind of read like stories that were in a novel. Parts of it were lists of names. Parts of it were really dry and confusing laws. Parts of it were these crazy, fantastical stories. And then parts of it were super unnecessarily wordy. Kind of like, dude, I just read that. Why are you saying that again? And so it was daunting, and so I tried to read it, but many, 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 many times I'd be reading through the Old Testament, and I would just stop because I didn't know how to read it. I didn't know what to do with it. So, now, as I've grown into enjoying the Old Testament and loving the Old Testament, it is still a challenge for me to read. There are still parts of it that read like stories in a novel. There are still parts of it that are lists of names. There are still parts of it that are really dry and confusing laws, and there are still parts that are crazy, fantastical stories. But I have been introduced to a tool over the last few years that has helped me to get a better understanding and a better grasp of how to read the Old Testament, and even parts of the New Testament. And so one of the things that we discussed in the What is the Old Testament workshop was the natural progression of how stories came into the Old Testament and into the Bible. So first of all, stuff happened. Life happened. Moses did this thing and Abraham did that thing and so on. And so as stuff happened, people told stories about those things, about the stuff that happened in order to remember that stuff happened. If they didn't tell those stories, then people would just forget and it would be like that it didn't exist. And so, today we have the internet. I'm a freakish fan of ChatGPT, where I'll be just sitting down and I was like, ChatGPT, tell me about this thing. We can just instantly look stuff up. But back in the day, people typically only just talked about stuff. Very few people could read, and even fewer people could even write. And so what they would do is they would tell these stories, and they'd tell them over and over and over again. And to make that retelling easier to remember, quite often these stories were told in poetic form. Poetry uses rhythm, and it uses meter, and it has lots of repetition. And so these things make it a lot more easier to remember things, particularly long stories. This can be seen in the poetry of the Old Testament, which we'll look at in a bit. But it also gets carried over into the narrative, into the stories of the Bible. And at some point, these stories are being told and retold. And in order to retain them, they were eventually written down. And whether they were written in actual poetic form or whether they were written in prose narrative, the poetics of their telling remained in place. And so, we can find in both poetry and in the narrative that there is a lot of rhythm and meter and structure and repetition. And that these are design features that we can find in both poetry and narrative. And so these features are a major part in how the Bible communicates, how the Old Testament communicates. So in other words, the structure of the passage, the structure of the story, the structure of the book tells us as much about what the author is trying to say as the words that the author is using. So that's what we're going to be looking at today. Now, typically when people talk about how to read the Old Testament, because the Old Testament is broken down into categories that we call genres, like history and poetry and the prophets and so on, because that's how our modern minds work, we tend to focus on how to read each of these genres. That's a very common thing of, there's one of my favorite books that I got in college is How to Read the Bible for All It's Worth. And it's the whole thing is how do you read different genres of the Bible? So the tools that we're going to be looking at today, it's actually going to push back against that just a little bit, and I'll explain why. So the reason is this. The Bible tells us that Jesus and the apostles had a Bible, and it was broken down into 3 sections. And we talked about this at the last workshop, but it's the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. We can see this breakdown, and this is passages on, I think, page 2 of your notes. But it's in Luke 24:44, it says, "Now Jesus said to his disciples, 'These are my words which I spoke to you while I was with you, that all things which are written about me in the Torah of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled.'" And so here's the thing. In the ancient mind, these sections, they're not genres. They're themes. And the breakdown into genres, it's a Greek thing that happened late in the development of Jesus' Bible. And it's something that we hold on to today. So Jesus said that. And then on top of that, in Paul's second letter to Timothy, Paul writes in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, he says, "You, Timothy," he's talking to, "continue in the things you have learned and become convinced of, knowing from what you have learned how from childhood you have known the sacred scriptures, which are able to give you wisdom that leads to salvation through faith." And so here Paul is talking about the sacred scriptures. And so the title of the sacred scriptures is referring to everything that Jesus was referring to, the Torah, the prophets, and the writings. And so what Paul says, and what does Paul say that the sacred scriptures do? They're able to give you wisdom that leads to salvation through faith. And so the Torah and the prophets and all of the writings give wisdom that leads to salvation through faith. There is no differentiation between wisdom literature and history and prophets. It's all doing the exact same thing. And of course, so that brings up the question, does that mean that we should throw out the genres that we have in our Christian Bible? And of course not. It just means that we need to rejigger how we think about those genres. When the ancient authors, who were all almost exclusively prophets of God, when they wrote what we call history, they wrote from a certain point of view with a certain message in mind. And it was a point of view and a message that gave wisdom to the reader that leads to salvation through faith. So rather than focusing on genres and the various challenges that come from understanding each genre, we're going to focus on one aspect of Hebrew literature that permeates every inch of Hebrew literature. And by doing so, we will learn a tool to start. That was the thing I was trying to remember. Today, I'm going to hammer this home, this point home, but I just, see, that's how it goes. That's how it goes. I'm a tool, so this is, what I'm putting in your hands today is a tool. That's what I want everybody to come away with. This is a tool. And it's like a screwdriver that when you hand someone a screwdriver, they might be able to kind of get an idea of how to use it at first. But over time, the more you use it and the more you use it, the better you are with it. And you know that you can use a screwdriver for more than just use screws. So anyway, a tool. No, you're welcome. Thank you. So, yes. So the idea is that I want to put a tool in our hands today that can help us to dig deeper and understand the Old Testament better, and even be able to use it in parts of the New Testament. And so we'll be doing that by first looking at Hebrew poetry, and then by looking how the poetics of Hebrew poetry permeates the design and the structure of biblical narrative to the point where the design and the structure tell as much about the narrative as the words within the narrative. So, first we'll look at understanding how to read Hebrew poetry. Now, talking about Hebrew poetry can quickly become boring, especially if you're someone who doesn't like to talk about poetry at all. And so, one of the things that we would do is kind of like dissecting a butterfly versus like watching a butterfly, fly through the air. Most everybody likes the butterfly flying through the air. Very few people like to dissect it. So, what I'd actually like us to do is to first, I want to have everybody watch a butterfly fly through the air before we get into dissecting it. And so I'm going to do that by reading Psalm 29. And so Psalm 29 is in your notes. It's on page 3. But what I want you guys to do first is I want you to just listen to me as I read it. And hopefully you guys can kind of start picking up on what I've been talking about so far. So this is what Psalm 29 says. It says, "Give to Yahweh, O sons of God. Give to Yahweh glory and strength. Give to Yahweh the glory due his name. Worship Yahweh in the majesty of his holiness. The voice of Yahweh is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. Yahweh over the mighty waters. The voice of Yahweh is powerful. The voice of Yahweh is majestic. The voice of Yahweh breaks the cedars. Yahweh breaks in pieces the cedars of Lebanon. He makes Lebanon leap like a calf, Mount Sirion like a wild ox. The voice of Yahweh strikes with flashes of fire. The voice of Yahweh shakes the desert. Yahweh shakes the desert of Kadesh. The voice of Yahweh shakes apart the oaks and strips the forest bare. And in his temple everything shouts glory. Yahweh is enthroned over the flood. Yahweh is enthroned as King eternal. Yahweh gives strength to his people. Yahweh blesses his people with peace." And so that's Psalm 29. So without talking about what it's actually talking about, what kind of communication strategies or patterns did you guys see in there? Repetition. Yep. Anything else? We're going to dissect this in just a moment. So,
Short thoughts rather than long paragraphs.
Yep.
Short thoughts.
Yep. Yep.
It's like details tagged on. So you'll say a thought and then like add details to that thought.
Yeah.
The water, these type of water.
Yeah.
These type of sugar.
Yep. Yep. Yeah, there are different patterns and there's different repetition, and they work in different ways. Verses 1 and 2 are a stanza of 4 lines. So stanza is just when things are grouped together, and they kind of have this 1, 2, 3 surprise pattern to them. Do you see that? It's give, worship. Look at the first line. It says, give to Yahweh, O sons of God. Well, give what? It kind of delays what you are to give until the next line. So then it says, give Yahweh glory and power, and the glory due his name. And if we're giving God his glory and power, and the glory due his name, what in effect are we doing? We're worshiping him. It's like the 1, 2, 3, and then the punchline is the effect of the repetition. And so that's one form of repetition. Another is the bracketing that happens with the first and the last stanzas. Key words that show up are glory and strength. Having key words show up at the beginning and the end is an important feature of biblical poetry and in biblical literature. Some people call it framing or inclusio, meaning it's wrapping it all together with the beginning and the end. And so glory and strength. How do glory and strength come up in the first stanza? It's what we give to Yahweh. And so when you go down to the last stanza, you see that everything in the temple is shouting glory. So there's glory is repeated there. And the temple is the place of worship. Well, notice how strength gets reversed in this last stanza. In the first stanza, God's worshipers are giving him strength. In the last stanza, God gives strength and blessing to his people. And so if you're wrapping the beginning and the end together, where in this worshiping scene is happening in the temple. And then in the repetition, it mentions actual places that show that there's a physical landscape on the author's mind. He talks about Lebanon and Mount Sirion and Kadesh. In the notes on page 4, there's a simple map of the Holy Land that shows the order of the poem from the northern forests of Lebanon to the southern desert of Kadesh. And then Mount Sirion is the highest mountain peak in the Lebanon mountain range. And so what does God do to these places? He breaks the cedars of Lebanon, and he makes Lebanon and Mount Sirion leap like baby livestock. And then in the south, he shakes the desert and the trees. And so what's going on here? Well, one of the repeated things we haven't talked about yet is the voice. And I think that's the thing that stands out. Yes, go ahead.
You just reminded me, I forget the name of the class that teaches you how to do speeches.
Debate.
The what?
Debate.
Speech class?
No, they have clubs.
Toastings.
Toastmasters.
Yeah.
Well, from what I learned from that is, you could do it in sermons, but you might have learned that too, is you tell people what you're going to tell them.
Yep.
And then you tell them.
Sure.
And then you tell them what you told them.
Sure.
And so that's
Sure.
That's just.
Yeah, it has that feel to it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the repeated words is Yahweh's voice. And so the word for voice, which is pronounced kol, and so kol gets repeated, kol Yahweh, the voice of Yahweh. Kol also means noise or sound of an instrument. And a lot of times it is translated as thunder. And so in this psalm, Yahweh's voice is over the waters. It thunders. It's powerful and majestic. It breaks the cedars. It makes the countryside and the mountain leap. It strikes with flashes of fire. It shakes the desert and the trees. What does this sound like this is describing? I'm pausing if you guys want to answer. Can you, what's that? You're welcome. Okay.
Sounds like something powerful.
Yep. It sounds like a thunderstorm that is traveling from the Mediterranean Sea over the land of Israel. And it's making everything shake and rattle and roll from the north to the south. But the author writes about it in such a way as to give God glory and honor and power. And so on one level, we're talking about a thunderstorm. The voice of Yahweh is like thunder that's, it's shaking all these things. But then the poet wants us to imagine that if Yahweh is the king of heaven and earth, who rules from his heavenly temple, then the most mighty destructive elements of creation are just like his tools. And they are Yahweh's power expressed in great wonder and majesty. And then on top of that, once the thunderstorm metaphor lands, then verse 11 really kind of has this interesting landing spot too, because Yahweh wants to give that power that he has on display to his people. And so there is so much more that we can look at. As we keep going, I do want to acknowledge that I have been wrestling with all of this stuff that we're talking about for years at this point. I have sat at the feet of people who have been wrestling with this kind of stuff for decades. So it is okay if you're struggling with this. Again, shooting a water hose or fire hose right at you kind of thing. So there is so much more to this that we can look at. But what Psalm 29 shows is how an author takes a real event and he tells that event with poetic form in order to convey a theological message. How long do you think it took someone to sit down and compose this? I mean, do you think he just scratched it out in a minute? This poem has been carefully put together in order to deliver a message. It's kind of like how much time Mike and I put towards our sermons. That's kind of a joke. Sorry. So, it's to both of us. And so what I want us to notice is how inseparable the message is from the way that the message is delivered. Through repetition and design are used. And so words and ideas are not only repeated, but they are tweaked a little bit. This is kind of what John is talking about. They're tweaked in order a little bit to kind of expand on our understanding, where it's the waters in this line, and then it's the waters of this in this line. And so my hope is that as we look at more examples, we can gain tools and skills for reading other biblical poems as well as biblical narrative, because biblical narrative, again, it shares the same traits as biblical poetry. And so learning how to understand the function of repetition and of literary design is one of the most fundamental tools in understanding biblical literature. And again, it crosses both poetry and narrative. So what we're going to do now is take a quick look at other examples of biblical poetry in order to understand a little bit better. So we'll start with the smallest level of repetition in biblical poetry, and we'll build up to a little bit bigger pieces. But before we jump into these examples, I want to remind us of the typical features that we find in poetry in general. And Debbie kind of mentioned this a little bit. Poetry communicates with fewer words than normal speech. It's very dense and it's very short with its words. Poetry intentionally uses creative language. It uses unique word combinations and repetition. Poetry heavily uses imagery and metaphor. Think about all those 1980s rock songs that have very creative ways of talking about sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And then lastly, poetry invites the reader into an artistic encounter with the hopes of communicating more than just the words say, how they appear on page. Again, think of those rock songs. So it's designed to cause our imagination to activate. And it does this mainly through rhythm and meter and measure. Well, Hebrew poetry that we find in the Bible has all of these same traits, except it doesn't rely on rhyming. I don't know if you've ever read Hebrew poetry, you realize there is zero rhyming in it, like we see in modern pop songs. And then it also has a different way of handling meter. The praise songs that we sing on Sunday morning, there's a pretty tight meter to it, that a lot of the lines have a similar length and all that kind of stuff, and that kind of thing. So Hebrew poetry is free form. There is no consistent meter to it, and it creates a rhythm by how the lines and the verses are put together, which is what we're going to be looking at for the next little bit. And so biblical scholar Robert Loth, he coined a word to describe how Hebrew poetry works, and that word is parallelism. We're getting there in the notes. I forgot what page. I didn't write that one down. Thank you. 6. So parallelism is when one line of a poem or one line of a verse, it corresponds with another line or verse. Sometimes the second line or verse expands on the first. Sometimes they are equivalent. Sometimes they contrast. And sometimes they're just structured similarly. And so the goal of parallelism is to place two or more things in comparison with each other so that their uniqueness and meaning become more visible after the comparison. Again, kind of what John was talking about. And so we're going to take a quick look at some parallelism examples in the Hebrew Bible. You can find these starting on page 7 of your handout. The first one that we're going to look at is comparison and analogy. So with comparison and analogy, the corresponding words and images are meant to cause us to reflect on shared attributes of the paired items. For instance, Psalm 33:6 says, "By the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their host." Do you guys see that there? The word of Yahweh is compared to the breath of his mouth in the first and second line. And then the heavens were made is compared with all their host. So there's this comparison between these things to kind of explain them more. Another example is Isaiah 44:3. It says, "For I will pour out water on the thirsty land and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit on your offspring and my blessing on your descendants." And so obviously the phrase "I will pour out" is repeated, but what is poured out? So water is poured out, and it is compared to God's spirit. And the thirsty land and dry ground are compared to offspring and descendants. And then streams are compared with God's blessing. Do you guys see that? Okay. And so this is a form of parallelism that uses comparison and analogy. Another form of parallelism is contrast. With contrast, the corresponding words and images are meant to cause us to reflect on the differences highlighted by contrast. So Proverbs 10:11 says, "The mouth of the righteous is a fountain of life, but the mouth of the wicked conceals violence." So the mouths of the righteous and the wicked, they're contrasted against each other, and we see that they have very different end results. And so this is a form of parallelism that uses contrast. This is a form that is very common in the Proverbs. If you read the Proverbs much, you'll see a lot of, hey, this is this, but this is that. So then another form of parallelism is complement. With complement, the second line complements the first line in such a way as to complete a thought or image to elevate the point being made. An example is Psalm 133:1. "Behold how good and pleasant it is for brothers to dwell together in unity." Look at how good and pleasant it is. When? Well, when brothers live together in unity. Brothers dwelling in unity completes the thought. It complements the first line. Okay, and then there is Habakkuk 3:2, which says, "Lord, I have heard the reports about you, I fear. Yahweh, renew your works in the midst of the year. In the midst of the year, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy." Do you feel the cadence there? I've heard this report about you, and I'm afraid. Renew your work in the midst of years. And there's repetition. In the midst of years, make it known. In wrath, remember mercy. You're feeling drawn to this, to connect the fear of God and the report about God with an intense event. And Yahweh, the way that he acts in history is sometimes it's really intense. You know, kingdoms fall, the mighty are brought low, and then in the middle of this repetition is this repetition that links it. In the midst of years, do your thing. In this context, it's the Exodus thing. Here in our own day, the thing that you did in the past, do it again. Renew your work. But then he's like, but go easy on me on us when you do it. And then the final form of parallelism, which is sequence. With sequence, the lines aren't strictly parallel, but they develop a short narrative sequence. One example is Psalm 31:1. "In you, Yahweh, I have taken refuge. Let me never be ashamed. In your righteousness, deliver me." It kind of builds, just creating this sequence of ideas. And then another example is Proverbs 4:10. "Hear, my son, and accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many." It's poetry, but it sounds like a normal, complete thought. So these are some quick examples of biblical parallelism. And the reasoning behind, and what's the reasoning behind and the benefit of using parallelism like this? There's a biblical scholar named Jan Folkelman who describes it something like this. He says, when you look through a set of binoculars, what you're actually seeing is two images, one image per eye. If you close one eye, you'll see a slightly different image when you close the other one. So what binoculars do is they take these two images and they create one image inside your brain. Biblical parallelism is doing something similar. It creates two images, whether slightly different or contrasting, and then it lets them sink in together, allowing them to interact in a way that creates a new image in your head. We see the thing from multiple angles, and it gives more depth to what we're looking at. And this is what biblical parallelism does. It uses repetition and speaking in pairs to give us a more in-depth picture. Again, kind of like John pointed out, it's not just waters, it's waters like this. So, we're going to get into some larger examples in just a moment, but before we go, since, again, fire hose and all of this stuff is very foundational, is there anyone who is completely lost at this point? Not that, I'm not asking, hey, do you have it like down pat, but is there anyone that's so like lost that I want to, okay, good, okay. No pop quiz, not yet. So this stuff, my hopes is that as we keep going, you'll see this stuff like show up more and more and more in the examples that we're talking about. So let's hop into some larger examples of some parallelism and poetics and stuff like that. And as we do, what we'll see is how authors use parallelism and symmetry to compare words and ideas in lines that aren't even next to each other, or sometimes are very far apart. So the poetic lines are given a symmetrical design so that the readers notice parallels in lines that are not next to each other. And so we're going to look at some examples, and these are starting on page 9. But before we jump into that, we're going to start seeing something in these examples that we haven't talked about yet. One of the ways that people like to map out parallelism or matching or symmetry between lines is they use letters as of the alphabet as labels for each one of these lines. So for instance, A, B, B, A, B, C, B, A, and so on. And so we're going to see this in almost every example that we look at going down the road. And all that is A's are supposed to compare or contrast with each other, B's and E's, D's, and so on, and all that kind of stuff. So just keep that in mind. So let's look at Psalm 137, verses 5 and 6. And this is what it says. It says, "If I forget you, Jerusalem, let my right hand wither, let my tongue stick to my palate, if I don't remember you." Do you guys see the parallelism in that? If I forget you, from line 1, if I don't remember you, in the 4th line. And then let my right hand and let my tongue are compared to each other. And so the two A lines have a symmetry between them, and the B lines have a symmetry between them. And this uses comparison between lines to paint a picture. Okay, let's look at another example. Psalm 33, 10 and 11. "Yahweh frustrated the plans of the nation. He reduced to nothing the schemes of the people. Yahweh's plans endured forever, the schemes of his heart from the generation to generation." Do you see what's going on there, the parallelism that's going on there? Lines A and B, they're kind of grouped together and they complement each other, but then the two sets of A and B contrast with each other. Another example is a little bit bigger. This is Psalm 31, 23 and 24. It says, "Love the Lord, all you his godly ones. The Lord preserves the faithful and fully recompenses the proud. Be strong and let your heart take courage, all you who hope in the Lord." So this one's a bit more challenging. And it stretches our minds a bit, but it helps. It's been broken down for us. In the breakdown, do you see the patterning? Love the Lord is paired with be strong and let your heart take courage. And those are actions that we can take, and they're compared with each other. And so now what parallelism invites us to do is to not just compare those two things, but like the binoculars, it's to combine those two things. Loving the Lord shows itself in being strong and letting our heart take courage. And so then let's look at letter B. All you, his godly ones, versus all you and all you who hope in the Lord. Again, compare the two. The godly ones are those who hope in the Lord. And then letter C, the Lord preserves, or he protects the faithful, and he fully recompenses, or he repays the proud. And so this is a contrast between how the Lord treats the faithful and the proud, or the unfaithful. And so you can see the symmetry between the three lines, the A, B, and the C, but you also see a progression of the thought. the A, B, C, C, A, B. There's a rhythm to it, but there's also a freedom of form to it. Okay? You guys doing okay? Okay, let's look at a bigger one then. We're going to keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger. By the end, we're just going to do the whole Bible. That's not true. Okay, so this is Proverbs 4, 1 through 4. Hear, my son, and accept my sayings, and the years of your life will be many. I have directed you in the ways of wisdom. I have led you in upright paths. But when you walk, your steps will not be impeded, and if you run, you will not stumble. Take hold instruction, do not let go. Guard her, for she is your life. Again, this is broken down for us, but you see the patterns that are showing up in this one. In the two A's, we have accept and take hold. And my sayings and instructions and your life and your life. There's this parallelism. These lines frame the entire stanza. They're matching even though they aren't right next to each other. And then in the first B, we have I have directed and I have led, which is compared to when you walk and if you run in the second B line. And then also in the B lines, we have the ways of wisdom compared to upright paths, which are both compared to your steps will not be impeded and you will not stumble. The ways of wisdom are upright paths that don't prevent people from moving forward and won't cause them to stumble. And where does this wisdom come from? And how do we get it? Well, it's the author's sayings and instructions. And we get it by accepting it and taking hold of it. Do you see how that parallelism works? Okay. Parallelism's cool in my mind. I love it. It's so fun. Okay. One last example. What's that? We're dissecting butterflies? Yes, I know. This, I don't apologize, but Yes. Yes, I am.
I enjoy dissecting sentences, but not that much.
Sure. Well, yes.
And he prefers school, not geek.
Nerd. No. So anyway, let's look at a whole poem this time. And this is Psalm 67. So this is what it says. It says, may God be gracious to us and bless us and make his face shine upon us, Selah. That your ways may be known in the land, your salvation among all the nations. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. May the nations be glad and sing for joy. For you rule the peoples with justice and guide the nations of the land, Selah. May the peoples praise you, O God. May all the peoples praise you. Then the land will yield its fruit, and God our God will bless us. May God bless us, that all the ends of the land may fear him. Do you see the rhythm and the repetition in this one? So not every line and idea matches perfectly, but that's by design, and it's in order to cause us to wrestle with the pictures that are being painted here. So the author uses repeated words or similar ideas to compare and contrast the similarities and differences to build on ideas. And so we can see it happening in the A's and in the B's and then C. I don't know if you noticed the two C's are literally copy and paste from each other. And then there's D's, and then E is at the very center of the poem. So this is when it starts getting into the really cool, meaty stuff that I like. So in modern storytelling, stories are written in a way to build towards what we call a climax, where the main issue, the conflict or whatever, the resolution of the story, it takes place. And so it tends to be the main focus of a story, of why the story is being told. And usually the climax takes place, or after the climax takes place, the action or the tension of the story, it lessens. And then the story usually comes to an end. And so because of this, the climax of a story in modern storytelling tends to be towards the tail end of the story, because you don't want this big climax and then all of a sudden you've got like 47 chapters. It's like the tail end of Lord of the Rings movies. It's like, oh, okay, finish it already. Anyway, so in ancient Hebrew literature, the main point or the main focus of what is trying to be told is in the middle. It's in the very center of what's being told. So for Psalm 67, the main point of the poem, based on the intentional design of this poem, is letter E, where it says, God rules the people with justice. And then the rest of the poem, building up to that point from the beginning and moving away from that point, it supports that idea. So, so it builds up to the middle and it builds away from the middle, and it's the whole thing. They're all pointing to it. And so that is how Hebrew literature works, whether it is in poetry or whether it's in stories. And we'll get into that a little bit when we get into the stories and the narrative. And then one final nugget to point out. You'll notice in the two A's, in the two A lines, there are two words that are highlighted, and they have some little Hebrew and behind it. And it's shine and fear. So in Hebrew, the language of Hebrew, these two words are connected through wordplay. So ancient Hebrew only uses consonants. It doesn't have vowels. Vowels were added significantly later than when this was written. And then on top of that, Hebrew words, their root words, only have 3 consonants in it. I mean, every single root word, there's only 3 consonants in it. So shine and fear, although they have different root words, they're actually made up with the exact same 3 consonants, just in a different order. And so what the author is doing is he is creating a wordplay, a graphical wordplay showing that there's some parallel relationship between God's face shining and the land fearing, the people fearing. Anybody familiar with the story of Moses when his face is shining and the people are afraid of him? So this is this idea that's being painted. And so we don't see this. It's almost impossible to see a lot of this wordplay in our English translations. But when you get into the Hebrew, there's a ridiculous amount of wordplay. They're just a bunch of jokesters. And it's all over the place. So that was a crash course on biblical poetry, with its rhyme and its meter and its free form and its parallelism. This is there's obviously a lot more that we could look at. But these are the building blocks that we have to dig deeper and to try to understand it more. And what I've hoped that we've done is to put a tool in your hands that you can learn and that you can work with on your own and improve if you so desire to annihilate these things and dissect them. Because as we'll look at in a little bit, this tool doesn't just work with ancient Hebrew poetry. It works for biblical narrative as well. But before we jump into that, does anybody have any questions? This would be a great time, if you so desire, to go to the bathroom. But we are going to be starting in 10 minutes, whether you're back or not. We're starting again in 10 minutes. So
you are taking a break. You're not taking a break.
Yeah, this is a chance to ask questions and or go to the bathroom, but you have 10 minutes. If I know, that's why I said 10 minutes. I'm going to start pounding on doors. I know, I knew I shouldn't have done it, but...
This idea of the binoculars and how our brain does that automatically.
Mm-hmm.
Trying to translate that to this, because our brain definitely doesn't do this automatically.
No.
It takes
No.
a lot of work to try to see it through both.
Yes.
I'm trying to think of, how do we enjoy that butterfly without annihilating it through dissection?
Yes.
Finding a way to do both of those things
Yeah.
somehow. To appreciate the beauty, but still understand the depth of it.
Yeah. Well,
It just takes practice.
yeah, and a lot of that too is, I think, the more you realize that exists, the more you see it. And then I think the more you see it, the more it just naturally, your brain kind of naturally starts to do that. And so I think then you're able to see the beauty of it a lot quicker. Kind of thing. And that's stuff that, like, as I'm preparing for a sermon, I'll be reading something in a passage, and all of a sudden I'm just like, oh, that ties into, like, this little obscure thing ties into this little obscure thing. And that's not because, a lot of it is just this. I've picked it up over time. I've picked up the tool of very few words, almost no words in Scripture are just unintentionally there. There's so many ties and repetition and all that kind of stuff. And so just a lot of it is just the more you use the tool, I think the quicker you'll get at it. And when I see those things in, this little thing here, that just brings complete awe to me. And it's just like, oh, dude, that was so cool that.
So the analogy, it's the difference of like seeing a butterfly and going, that's pretty, versus having done a dissection and seeing the butterfly and being like, that's amazing because now I know
Yeah.
how it flies.
Yeah.
The inner workings.
In the inner workings and stuff like that, yeah.
It's kind of like a depth of appreciation.
Yeah. Yeah. Hey.
I didn't catch the beginning of the conversation, but did
I meant to have zero.
the English language
Oh.
take direction from Hebrew?
Ancient Hebrew? What do you, and what do you mean, like?
On how they present, like in stories of today, novels,
No, it was ancient Hebrew. The way they structured their literature is actually really unique. Like there wasn't even when you compare them to the people, their contemporaries who were alive at the same time as them. The ancient Hebrew literature, the way they structured it was unique to them. Like you're not going to find many examples of it outside of ancient Hebrew, kind of thing. And so I think the whole like building to a climax and all that kind of stuff, that I think was more, it's probably more like Greek influenced and all that kind of stuff, and just. But
in speech,
yeah,
like I said,
yeah,
Toastmasters,
sure.
there's that.
Yeah, tell them what you're going to tell them, and tell them what you told them. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. So ancient Hebrew literature is it's intriguing where when you're reading through a story, it's, again, we'll get into it, but there is an intentional design where it tends to kind of have this curve to it, and whatever's happening in the middle tends to be, not always, but it tends to be that's the thing that it's trying to focus on, the message that it's trying to focus on, kind of thing. So, for instance, the story about Joseph. So in Genesis 37 to 50 is about Joseph. What you'll notice is that the structure of that is there's 3 literary units, 3 sections in it, and each one of those is broken down into 3 sections. And then each one of those 3 sections is broken down into 3 more sections. And then the very middle, in the story of Joseph, is a story about his brother Judah being willing to sacrifice his life for his brother. So, and so that's the part of the main focus of that story of Joseph is how Judah, it's like, why does Jesus, the line of Judah, why does Jesus come from Judah? Okay, well, here's this great example of Judah being someone willing to sacrifice his life for an innocent person, kind of thing. So,
It also connects with how our memory works, how our
yep,
mental
yep,
works.
yep, absolutely.
God knew what he was doing.
Yeah, yeah, and again for the ancient Hebrew, yeah, and for the ancient Hebrew people, I mean, if you keep the main point, the central point, and then and that's like, hey, this is what every story is going to be like, everything's going to be like. It's like, oh, well, the stuff that I'm listening to as we get to the center point, it's like, oh, that it's building up to here, and then once you get, it's like, oh, then we know it's everything else is supporting that idea, and so, yeah.
Today in our friendships and our relationships, it's like, I'm sure I mean,
Mm-hmm.
you wanna say, okay, what's the point of this?
Yes. Yeah.
You know?
Sure.
It's like, okay, get to the point, and then you can
Yep.
describe it a little bit more if you want to.
Yep.
But where is this going?
Yeah.
I mean, it's like, you don't wanna be nasty, but it's like, I'm lost.
Yeah.
You know?
Yep.
I know people, friends like that.
Well, speaking of getting lost, let's go ahead and start this back up again. That's a nice segue, I know.
Well, all who lost are, all who wander are not.
That is correct. I appreciate that, yes. Yeah. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and turn our focus to biblical narrative then, which is part 2 in your handout. So, but before we jump into examples, first want to put some ideas on the table that can be very helpful for us as we're thinking about biblical narrative. Biblical narrative makes up about 2/3 of the entire Bible. And quite often, when we think about biblical narrative, we think about it as history, as stuff that happened. And so, yes, these things did happen, of course. But is that all that's going on with biblical narrative? Is it just that we're being told interesting or important things that happened? Or is there more going on? So, we didn't talk much about this when we were looking at poetry earlier, but even taking a quick glance at what we looked at, we can see that the authors of poetry that we looked at, they put in some, if not a whole lot of time and effort and probably prayer and meditation into their work. There is some wonderfully intentional craftsmanship in the poetry that we looked at. And that craftsmanship can be found in every bit of Hebrew poetry in the Bible. Well, the exact same thing can be said about every bit of biblical narrative as well. And so something that I like to do when I'm watching something or I'm reading something that I'm really familiar with, like watching a Star Wars movie or reading a Lord of the Rings books or something like that, is to try to pull back from those things and to see them with fresh eyes, which can be challenging. And so this can help me see things and understand things in a different way. I try to make the overly familiar become unfamiliar. And so I'd like us to do that today by looking at 2 images that we can find on page 14. If you're not familiar with these images, the image on the left is from the Hubble telescope taken in 2009. It's called the Deep Field image. And so what it was is some astronomers, they were looking up in the night sky and they saw this just giant empty space in the sky. And so they're like, hey, let's just point a camera up here and see what we can see. And so then they just kind of let this long exposure happen. And then what they discovered is this giant empty space that they thought was giant and empty is that there were thousands of galaxies full of stars and planets and so on. And so they were just really surprised by this. And so that's the image on the left. And so on the right, we have Vincent van Gogh's famous painting, Starry Night. And so here's a silly question for you. Which of these 2 images depicts the night sky as it actually is? Oh. Which of these, that's fine. Which of these 2 images, the Hubble, the Deep Field image, and Van Gogh's Starry Night, depicts the night sky as it actually is? Deep Field, sorry. Good for you. So yes, what we're looking at, neither one of them are actually depict the night sky as it actually is. What?
When I look out at night, I see the one on the left more so. I've never seen the sky look like.
Sure. But the question is though, is that picture that you're looking at, is that actually the night sky? No, it's a picture of the night sky. Yeah. See? Yes. Yep. So what we're looking at is representations of the night sky, as someone brilliantly read. So the nature of the night sky is that it can only be represented when we are looking directly at the night sky. And even then, we're only seeing it from one vantage point. It would look different from a million miles away into space, or even 1,000 miles away on our own planet. So what this points out is that when we represent reality to each other, we are giving an interpretation of it. And this is the very nature of finite human existence. We can't help this. This is just what happens. And so we should keep this analogy in mind as we're looking at past events. This is the space that I think an honest reading of biblical narrative invites us into. A biblical narrative is a highly designed and stylized kind of literature, and it's doing at least two things. One thing it's doing is it's recounting the story of Israel to show that stuff really happened. Abraham really did exist, and he did this thing, and he did that thing. But at the same time, it's also offering an interpretation of that stuff happening to help the reader see the meaning of what is happening. It's like Van Gogh's interpretation of the night sky with Starry Night, or the author of Psalm 29 with a thunderstorm. These aren't just archival documented recordings. This isn't just somebody walking around with a camcorder showing that things happened. They are artistic depictions of real things that are given meaning by how they are displayed. So the same thing. So the same types of techniques and conventions that are used in Hebrew poetry are also used in biblical narrative. Now, one last thing I want to quickly address before we move on. Most, if not all of us, who have read or are familiar with the Bible, we have come across someone who questions whether or not events in the Bible really took place. So saying that the authors used artistic, poetic design in telling these stories in no way says that those things did not exist. This is something that I've had to wrestle with as my mind has been opened up to the idea of how biblical narrative works. These events really took place, but because of the points of view of the authors and the theological messages that they're trying to make, they wrote them and they designed them in such a way as to put focus on the theological message. Again, think Psalm 29 and a thunderstorm. Thunderstorms traveling from the Mediterranean Sea over Israel are real events. How they are described is an interpretation of those events. Artistic retelling does not negate reality. So, let's start getting into the examples of poetics of biblical narrative. Yes?
The story of David and Goliath, or the story of Daniel in the lion's den, are we supposed to, the most important thing is to get what it's trying to tell us, or did that really happen? Does it make a difference?
I would say yes. Yes. I'm saying both. That it is something that really happened, but the way the story is told puts it in a theological framework. So again, going back to Psalm 29 and a thunderstorm, that's the author of the poem is looking at a thunderstorm coming over Israel, and it's literally, it's shaking the ground, and there's thunder and there's lightning, but the author says this is God showing his power. This is, and so both are true. Yes, it is a true event, but it's being told in a way it's being interpreted in a way to give a theological message.
Well, and then we could say, like, George Washington crossed
The Delaware, yeah.
But did that really happen, or was that just a story, But there's documentation in history somewhere.
Yeah.
That's saying on that date.
Yeah.
That happened.
Go ahead.
Like you think of the Star Spangled Banner,
Yes.
it was describing a real event, this bombing of a fort, but
Mhm.
doing it in a way that was really meant to communicate something important.
Yeah.
So it's kind of that idea, right?
Yeah.
Like it's describing something real, but the point of that poem wasn't like to give you historical facts about this bombing of this fort.
Yeah.
It was to connote like an impression.
Yeah. And
Give you a sense of being there.
yeah. So I don't think we have any trouble picturing that in poetry. What I'm trying to get at, and we'll see some examples of it, is that in biblical narrative, and by narrative we can throw the word story and all that kind of stuff. Calling it that doesn't mean it's not real. Biblical narrative does the same thing that the poetry does. And so when we're seeing, the more you use this tool, all of a sudden you're going to start seeing these things like, oh, this isn't just, the author isn't just telling us a story like, hey, this is A happened, B happened, C happened, da 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 da. The author is actually arranging it in such a way to bring a central point to it and to show that this is how God is working through this thing. So let's go through this some more, and hopefully you can see it.
Well, I don't disagree with you.
Yeah.
Well, I'm thinking of people who I have to try to prove something to that didn't really happen.
Sure. And this may or may not address that specific thing the way that you want it to. But yeah, let's go ahead and keep going with this then. So we're going to look at some other examples, but before we do that, which is one of my favorite phrases, let's do a very quick crash course on the typical parts of a narrative and how the biblical authors use these parts. This is vitally important because these get used all the time. So the first thing that we're going to look at is plot. Simply put, the plot is the arrangement of characters and events into a meaningful sequence in order to communicate the meaning of a story. It's what drives the story forward. As we can see from the diagram on page 16, plots typically have an introduction, they have some form of conflict, an increase or an escalation of that conflict, and then a climax to that conflict, and then an event that brings that conflict to a head, which is followed by the resolution to that conflict, which then ends with a conclusion. So, for instance, the book of Jonah. The plot is God calls Jonah to go to the city of Nineveh and tell them that they are not on God's good side, and therefore there are going to be consequences. So the introduction is that the word of Yahweh comes to Jonah. The conflict is that Nineveh is wicked and something needs to happen about that. The climax happens when Jonah goes to Nineveh and tells them God's message. And the resolution is that the Ninevites repent. And then the conclusion is that the Ninevites are saved. And so this is the plot of the book of Jonah. Now, anyone familiar with Jonah might be saying, hey, we missed a whole bunch of stuff there that we were talking about. And so, yes and no. What I mentioned is the plot of Jonah. What I didn't mention is the subplot of Jonah. Like many good authors, biblical authors use subplots to drive the story forward. And in many instances, the subplot needs resolution before the main plot can be resolved. So in the case of the story of Jonah, the first conflict is introduced in the first couple of verses, but rather than progressing that story forward, a second conflict is introduced that sidelines the first conflict when Jonah, rather than being obedient to God, he runs away. And so that subplot needs to be resolved before the main plot can be resolved. And Jonah needed to be brought back full circle where he would finally be obedient to God and confront the Ninevites and bring a conclusion to the conflict between God and Nineveh. And so, of course, again, if you're familiar with Jonah, you see that the beauty of Jonah is this: once that conflict is resolved, there's this juicy little twist of how things end. And so this whole plots within plots within plots is how the story of the Bible is told. We're not going to look at it, but in the notes there's a quick breakdown about how the whole Bible works out the story of God and the nations on multiple levels of plots. And so, anyway, that's plots. Plots and subplots are some of the main parts of narrative. While the next obvious part of a narrative is the characters, the people who undergo the sequence of these events. Again, I realize that when I use the word characters, a lot of us in our modern thinking are thinking about people in, science fiction or, like Harry Potter is a character. Just by calling them characters, even though they're in the Bible, it doesn't negate that they were real people. It's just, this is just the way that we talk about them. In the notes, starting on page 20, there's a whole bunch of information on characters. We're going to kind of just skim over that really quick for time's sake. Characters in biblical narrative are the best way for biblical authors to communicate their moral vision. Meaning, most of the author's view of the world and the values that the author wants to communicate, it's done through characters. This is done by how a character is described and what information is given about them. For instance, Isaac's oldest son, Esau, is hairy. In the story, this means that he is outdoorsy and he's primitive and he behaves like an animal. And so this information, it informs the reader about the character. So what's interesting is describing a character in the Bible is not as common as we might think. In fact, what is more common is the fact that biblical authors also communicate through characters by what they don't say about them. For instance, Abraham lies about Sarah being his wife, and he allows her to be taken away by another man 2 times, but the author never chimes in to say that Abraham is wrong. Instead of moralizing about the character's decision, biblical authors quite often will simply just show the reader a character's decision and consequences of those decisions and allow the readers to wrestle with the impact of those decisions. And the reason behind this is because biblical characters are not so much models of behavior for us to follow as they are being held up as mirrors for self-reflection. To get us to ask the question of, what would I do in that situation? So in modern storytelling, we almost always expect characters to be fleshed out with detailed physical descriptions, mental and moral motivations, and so on. In biblical narrative, more often than not, characters are barely described at all, and their motivations are quite often left ambiguous. And what we learn about biblical characters is typically through their actions in various situations, and then we as readers are invited to wrestle with the outcome of those actions. So ambiguity is an intentional and widely used characteristic of biblical characters in biblical narrative. So that's how characters are used in the biblical narrative. Characters are a vital part of how biblical authors tell a narrative. Their actions and their inactions, how they are described and how they are not described, the words that they speak and don't speak, they all invite the reader to grapple with the moral vision of the biblical authors as well as with themselves as they see themselves mirrored in the biblical characters. Okay? And then the final part of biblical narrative is setting. Where something takes place in biblical narrative is important. As biblical stories develop, places begin to take on very symbolic, meaningful significance based on events that happen there. And then also how long an author focuses on something is meaningful. So I mentioned all of these things, the plot and the characters and the setting and all that kind of stuff, because what we'll notice as we hone this tool is that plots and characters and settings and all that kind of stuff, those things will get repeated again and again and again throughout Scripture. And it might not be like the exact same plot, but something very similar will happen. And the idea is we're supposed to hold those things in parallel with each other and say, oh, okay, these things are very similar. What's going on here? What's the same? What's different? And so on. Same thing with characters. Jesus, in the Bible they call it, or in education they call it a type. Like if someone is, Moses was like the first type of prophet. And so that person gets, so like when a new prophet arises, they're held to, are they like this Moses type? And so Jesus, like one of the amazing things about it is he fits all of these different types that are carried through the Old Testament and all that kind of stuff. And so that's how a character is repeated and replicated and all that kind of stuff. So, okay. So we're going to jump into examples very soon, but one last thing before we jump into examples. This may or may not be a new idea to you, but biblical narrative is written in such a way that for the most part, it's not telling us what to believe or not to believe. Biblical narrative is, it's not explicitly teaching us. I mean, I don't know if you've ever felt this as you're reading or trying to preach through narrative. It's very challenging because there's not a lot of, this is wrong, and this is wrong. So, and biblical authors do this on purpose. The design is, it's intentional to leave gaps for the readers to puzzle over. the authors are fully aware that this can be disorienting and that it causes readers to try to learn when they try to learn lessons from the past. It's not designed to explicitly teach, but it's designed to make the reader wrestle. For instance, polygamy, okay? Having more than one wife. Genesis 2:24, this is not in your notes, says, "For this reason, a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined with his wife, and they shall become one flesh." Okay? Here, the standard of one man and one woman is established. Well, all throughout the biblical stories, we see main characters like Abraham and David and Solomon and so on. They all have multiple wives. Well, a very common complaint amongst critics of Christianity and of God is that God does not explicitly say to these people, don't have multiple wives. And that's because he didn't. But according to, and so because he didn't, according to these critics, he either wasn't really against polygamy, or he's just some weak God or something like that. Well, what you read in biblical narrative is that every single time a man has more than one wife, bad things happen. There's not a single time in the biblical narrative where a man has more than one wife and something good happens. So this is the authors throwing this out, saying, hey, just writing, this bad stuff happens. And then it's for us as readers to read that and be like, okay, no, this is not good. Versus, the authors don't just say, this is bad. So it makes the reader wrestle with what the author is saying. Because biblical narrative is not explicitly designed to teach explicitly. So, now, are we getting there? Okay, we're almost there, sorry. A huge method used by biblical authors is what we saw in Psalm 29, but on a larger scale. So this is the repeated words and the design patterns and all that kind of stuff. In Psalm 29, we saw that in a very tight, packed thing, but now we're going to see it on larger scale. So stories and sections and books are intentionally designed in such a way to use various forms of parallelism like we saw in the poetry. And also like what we saw in the poetry, the authors intentionally repeat words and phrases and ideas in order to connect stories and sections and books together in brilliant and illuminating ways. And so one of the key features we need to be able to pick out when we're trying to figure out the design of these stories is where there are natural breaks, where there are transitions in the narrative. Sometimes these present themselves with a new character coming out of the scene, or there's a shift of time or something like that. Think about like a TV or movie. Stephanie has been watching a lot of Gilmore Girls lately. And so there will be a scene with the Gilmore Girls, and then all of a sudden it switches over to two other characters. That is a literary unit break when that kind of thing happens. So think about that. So in the notes, starting on page 26, we can see the Garden of Eden narrative broken down into literary units in two different charts. We're only going to glance at them, but it's there for you to look at. But what you'll notice is how the larger story is broken down into smaller parts. That's broken down into smaller units. That's broken down into smaller verses. Being able to see these units is a wonderful first step in helping us to see the design and the patterning that takes place. Because what you'll start to notice with these literary units as you improve this tool is how biblical authors tell these narratives using parallelism techniques that we saw in Hebrew poetry. And then another key feature that we'll see in biblical narrative that we need to learn to pick up is repeated words. Like in the poems like Psalm 29, where everything, again, is condensed. You can see these repeated words happening, boom, 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 boom. In biblical narrative, those repeated words are not necessarily as tight. They tend to be a little further away from each other. So it takes a little bit of a skill to pick up on that. So, for instance, Genesis 1. This is on page 28 of your notes. Genesis 1 says, "And God saw that such and such was good." So this phrase gets repeated 6 times. And then on the 7th time, it was very good. So the phrase, it was good, is like a drumbeat during the first 6 days. And then it sets the reader's expectations that once we get to day 7 and God is doing his thing, we're expecting it to be, and God saw that it was good. One more time, but instead we see God saw that it was very good. And so it kind of stands out and it feels climactic. So this is the author of Genesis 1 using a form of parallelism to convey a theological message. Genesis 1 is a narrative, but it feels like poetry. This kind of repetition can be found all over Genesis 1. So let's take an example of these design and repetition in a short story. This is in 2 Kings 4, 1 through 7. Again, you can find this on your notes in page 29. But don't follow along. I want to just read it, and I want to see if you guys can pick up on any repetition or parallelism that's going on here. So this is 2 Kings 4, 1 through 7. Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared Yahweh, and the lender has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." And Elijah said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your maidservant has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." And he said, Go request for yourselves vessels from outside, from your neighbors, empty vessels. Do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and you shall pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full. And she went from him, and she shut the door behind her and her sons. And they were bringing to her, and she was pouring. And it came about when the vessels were full, and she said to her son, Bring near to me another vessel. And he said to her, There is not another vessel. And the oil stopped. And she came and told the man of God, and he said, Go sell the oil and pay your lender, and you and your sons can live on the rest. Do you guys hear any repetition in there? It's not quite as clear as the poetry. Did you see any design? You can look at your notes now if you want to, if you hadn't already. Do you see any design in the narrative? Again, it's been broken down for you, so that might be a little bit easier to see. Can you imagine this as if it were an episode of a TV show of how it'd be playing out? We see a woman initiating a conversation with Elisha. She has a speech that creates the plot conflict for the episode about a death that leads to debt slavery. And then the camera, it shifts to Elijah, and he responds, What does this have to do with me? What do you have? And the camera back on her, I've got 1 jar of oil. Camera back to Elisha. Go do exactly as I instruct. And then her and her sons follow Elijah's instruction exactly, almost as if it was copy and pasted. And when Elijah said, and what Elijah said would happen is exactly what happened. And then you get another dialogue, this one between her and her son. And then coming full circle, she returns to Elisha where he tells her how to resolve the plot conflict by selling the oil. And so what started off with death and debt slavery ends with life and a debt paid. And so we can see this design pattern in repeated words. And again, this is a little more challenging than like Psalm 29. But there is this structure to it. And so the story is designed using repetition and parallelism and symmetry and to deliver its message. And what makes this even more interesting is actually that this is one of 14 sign and wonder stories about Elisha, the prophet. And so Elisha, he followed another prophet named Elijah. And there are 7 sign and wonder stories about it from Elijah. And so when Elijah was preparing to hand his ministry off to Elisha, he asked Elisha what he wanted, and Elisha said, Hey, give me 2. Give me twice as much of what you have. And so Elijah's like, okay. And so Elijah had 7 sign and wonder stories. Elisha has 14. And so Elisha becomes the new Elijah, who is the new Moses. See, this is this type that's a character that's being repeated. And Moses, he was the model prophet of Elijah, for Yahweh. And so this little narrative about this widow and her sons and their one jar of oil, it all of a sudden ties into this broader narrative about how obedience to Yahweh brings life and freedom from slavery. It's kind of like a microcosm of the Exodus story told in the life of this one family. So there's this repetition of ideas, and so there's this repetition of characters, and you can see the words vessel is repeated, and there's all kinds of repetition that happens in this. And so again, this is a tool that hopefully you guys can use. And so in your notes, we're not going to look at it right now because we don't have time and there's a lot. There's Genesis 39 is in there too. And so I think that's just another great place for you to look at on your own, and you can kind of wrestle with this some more. And so this type of thing happens on larger and larger scales all throughout the Bible. As an example, this is not in the notes, but in the structure of the Torah. Okay, so the Torah is the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. So Genesis and Deuteronomy, they both end in very, very similar ways. And there's a lot of similarities actually between Genesis and Deuteronomy. Well, Exodus is about Israel traveling through the wilderness and stopping at Mount Sinai. Numbers is about Israel starting at Mount Sinai and working their way through the wilderness before they get to Deuteronomy. And then right in the middle is the book of Leviticus, everybody's favorite book. In the very middle of Leviticus, remember, the middle is where the most important thing is. In the very middle of Leviticus, God is talking to the people about the Day of Atonement. The Day of Atonement is the one very special day where God and the people are made right with each other. So the entire structure of the first 5 books of the Bible have this parallelism and this repetition and this form that points to this idea of God making things right with his people. And so, like, when you ever think of, like, Moses, there's this story of Moses, and he hits the rock and water comes out. That shows up 2 times. They're parallel with each other in the Torah. So anyway, this kind of repetition and symmetry and form, it happens all over the place in the Hebrew Bible. And so we can see this we can see it in smaller units like 2 Kings 4, but we can also see it in multiple literary units when they're compared and contrasted with each other. So sometimes these literary units, they're right next to each other, like in Genesis 1 through 4, which is what we're going to look at right now, which you can see on page 32 in your notes. And so one of the many things that link Genesis 1 through 4 is the repetition of the word good. For most of us, I apologize, I'm running really late. If it's 11 o'clock and you want to leave, you may feel free to leave. Anyway, so
7 more minutes.
Okay. So one of the things that links Genesis 1 through 4 is the repetition of the word good. So most of us are familiar with the creation narrative in Genesis 1, where God speaks something into existence, and then he looks at it and he says, hey, this is good. You know, God saw that light was good, God saw that the vegetation was good, and so on. And so God saw that something was good in Genesis 7 times. What this repetition shows is that God is the provider and evaluator of what is truly good. God is the one who decides what is good. Well, in the next literary unit, which is the Eden narrative, in Genesis 2:4 through 3:24, we see good used again, but in a new and a creative way. Genesis 2:9 says, and Yahweh God caused the growth of every tree that was desirable to see and good for eating. And the tree of life was in the middle of the garden, and the tree of knowing good and bad. And so Genesis 1 taught us that God is the ultimate knower of what is good. We didn't look at it, but what we also know from Genesis 1 is that God appointed humans to rule the world on his behalf as his divine image. And so in this narrative, humans have a choice set before them, symbolized by these 2 trees. One tree represents life, which is good, and the other tree represents knowing good and bad. So will the humans allow God to be the prime knower of what is good and not good? Or will they take this knowledge for themselves? And then another repetition of good can be found in Genesis 2:18, where it says, then Yahweh God said, it is not good for a man to be alone. So again, we see that God is the evaluator of good and not good. And then in chapter 3, we see good repeated again. Chapter 3 is about the failure of mankind to allow God to be the evaluator of good and not good. And so the first 13 verses are about the snake convincing the woman, Eve, to take from the tree of the knowledge of good and bad. And right in the middle, in verse 6, it says, and the woman saw that the tree was good for eating, and she took from its fruit and she ate. The woman saw that blank was good. Does this phrase sound familiar? It was repeated 7 times in Genesis 1, and God saw that something was good. And so through the author's choice of repeated words, Genesis 2:6 portrays Eve as taking on the role of God, becoming the evaluator of good and not good. And then finally in chapter 4, the narrative about Cain and Abel, we see a lot of the same words and ideas repeated from chapters 2 and 3. There's a chart comparing the chapters on page 36 in the notes. Adam and Eve are given a choice to do good in chapters 2 and 3. Cain is told that if he does good, things will go well for him. Eve was tempted by an animal, a snake. Cain is told that sin crouches at the door like an animal wanting to devour him. After they sin, God asks Adam and Eve questions that he already knows the answer to. And then after Cain kills Abel, God asks Cain a question that he already knows the answer to. And so on. I'll let you guys explore that some more, just again for time's sake. But all of this repetition shows that in the Cain and Abel narrative, it shows that like his mom and dad, Cain was given a choice to do good and trust in God's knowledge of good and not good, but he didn't. And so his life repeated theirs in many ways. That's what this repetition shows. And so this is the author of the first 4 chapters of Genesis going hog wild with design patterns and repetition and parallelism between chapters to make theological points about God and man. He's not just telling a story. He's not just recounting it as it happened. Like the author of Hebrew poems, he's crafting the narrative with a theological worldview in mind to make specific points and also to make the reader wrestle with the words that are on the page. Hebrew poetry, like any good poetry, it requires our brains to wrestle with it because it tends to be short and punchy, and it leaves a lot to the imagination. Biblical narrative is the same. It wants us to dig deeper than the surface because the message that it is trying to give, they're deeper than the surface. So this type of thing that we saw in the back-to-back-to-back chapters, it also happens between literary units that are not next to each other. A very quick example, this is not in your notes, but we've been kind of hammering Genesis 1. Genesis is full of all these things that get set up, and it just gets repeated over and over and over throughout the scripture. But Genesis 1, we saw the phrase, and God saw that it was good. Okay, and then in Genesis 3, again, we saw Eve. Eve saw that it was good, and she took it. Okay, so an example of how an author is giving a theological message by the way he words something. In Genesis 6, we read, the sons of God, who are heavenly beings, saw the daughters of humanity that they were good, and they took for themselves wives. Do you see that design pattern? Okay. So this is an example of the heavenly beings stepping into God's role and deciding what is good and not good. And so Genesis 3 is considered, everybody here will call that, hey, Genesis 3 is the fall of mankind. Well, Genesis 6 is considered the fall of the heavenly beings, of the angels, because it follows the same pattern as Genesis 3, the fall of mankind. And so the intentional repetition informs the message that is being told by the authors. And this kind of stuff is all over the Old Testament. We are winding down here, just so you know. One final thing I want us to look at, in the academic world, we call it dynamic analogy. And so what does dynamic analogy mean? So we've been talking about analogies through this whole thing, when you compare one thing to another. For instance, when we compared God seeing good with Eve seeing good and with the sons of God seeing good. Those are all analogies. Well, dynamic analogy is when one person or thing in a narrative parallels with multiple characters or things in another narrative. And the purpose of this is to create a sense of instability in the narrative, challenging the reader to evaluate the situation and the characters fully. For instance, in the, again, we really like Genesis here. The narrative of Genesis 3 has a few main characters and some props. So there's God, and there's Adam, and there's Eve, and there's snake, and then there's the tree of the knowing of good and evil. Multiple times now we've looked at how those things compare with each other. So a dynamic analogy of Eve and what she saw and how she responded to it can be found in Genesis 12, 10 to 20. This one I hope it really hits home, and this kind of brings in this whole idea of repetition. You can find this on page 37 in your notes. Let me read it to you, and as I read it, I want you to just listen and see if you pick up on language that we've already been talking about. So this is Genesis 12, 10 to 20. Now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. And it came about when he came near to entering Egypt, he said to Sarai his wife, "Now I know that you are a woman beautiful of sight. And when the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife,' and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say that you are my sister, so that there will be good to me on account of you, that I may live on account of you." And it came about when Abram came to Egypt, and the Egyptians saw the woman was very beautiful, and Pharaoh's officials saw her and praised her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, and he did good to Abram on account of her. And there was for him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants and female donkeys and camels. And Yahweh plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues on account of Sarai, Abraham's wife. And Pharaoh called and said, "What is this you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister? And so I took your wife. Now then, here is your wife, take her and go." And Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all of his belongings. Did you guys hear any repetitions or any parallelisms going on in there? And if so, what did you hear?
The first part said there was a famine, and then the next line was the famine in the land was severe.
Yep, sure. Yep. Do you guys hear any key words, particularly of things that relate to Eve in the garden?
Well, the woman was beautiful of sight.
Yeah, she's good to look at.
Eve saw
Yep. Yep.
And that's compared to the tree was good for eating.
Yeah. Yep. And then what happened? What's that?
The result is the taking.
Yep.
Abraham's people are going to want to take you.
Yep. She was good to look at, and so she was taken. Okay? Yep. Yeah. So this is Hebrew authors taking words and repeating ideas and using parallelism to make us wrestle with things. And so now we're talking about dynamic analogy here, and so this is what happens here. In a logical analogy, okay, hold on. So Sarah was good to look at. She was she was taken. Who is the one who is deceived in this story? Pharaoh is deceived. And who is the one who deceived him? Abraham. Yeah. So the logical analogy, because Abraham and Sarai, they're God's chosen people, and Pharaoh, he's the king of Egypt, and Egypt, we know later on he's the bad guy, is we might think, well, Abraham and Sarai, they're Adam and Eve, and Pharaoh, he's the snake. Well, who is the snake in this narrative? It's Abram, yeah. And then who is the tree in this narrative? Sarah. and then Pharaoh is the deceived one, okay? So he's like Eve in this picture. But then also notice, I don't know if you noticed this, after Pharaoh discovers the wrongdoing that Abraham did to him, he says, "What is this you have done to me?" In the Garden of Eden, after Eve takes a bite and she gives it to Adam, God says, "What is this you have done?" And so in this story, what's going on is Pharaoh, not only is he like the Eve figure, but he's also like God in this. And so this is the dynamic analogy where authors love to take pictures of characters and then kind of paint them onto other, but then just mix it up. And the whole point is for us to wrestle with this and to realize that, hey, Abram, yes, he is the chosen one of God, but boy, he is not always acting like the chosen one of God. And so this is not designed to lift Abraham up and say, look at this great character for us to follow. It's designed for us to look at that as a mirror and like, okay, in my life, how am I acting? Am I acting right? Am I choosing what is good, or am I the snake kind of thing? And so that's dynamic analogy. Dynamic analogy you can find everywhere in Scripture. Dynamic analogy is what's happening with the types and with Jesus and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so what's that?
Noticing there's an echo to Genesis 6.
Yep.
Because Abraham assumes in the taking there will be killing.
Yes.
Like Cain and Abel.
Yep. Yeah. And so it's just very rich, and there's so many things that you can wrestle with. But we are almost done. So this was just one example. The whole Garden of Eden scene is actually analogized again and again and again and again and again all throughout Scripture. David and Bathsheba. David saw that she was good, and so he took her. And so that exact language is not used when you get into the story, but it's the same idea is there. So this is like a downfall of David moment kind of thing. And so the idea is that it's there on purpose to draw attention to the message that the author is trying to get. It's not just the words that the author uses, it's how he uses those words and where he uses those words. It's like poetry. It's done artistically. That's how biblical narrative works. And so the idea behind us looking at all of this is to have a tool that allows us to read the Old Testament better, both Hebrew poetry and narrative. The ancient authors who wrote this literature wrote it with a very specific method in order to help their readers not only memorize it better, but also to dig deeper and to wrestle with it and to meditate on it. One of the things that I heard recently, which I absolutely loved, is the Bible is not meant to just be read. It's meant to be studied. It's meant to meditate on it. And so if we can love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and if we can let them tell their stories the way they tell their stories, and let them, the way that they wrote it, I think it can be all the more enriching to us. And so my hope as we close today's workshop, which we're really closing it down, is that we can all come away with a tool that helps us to dig deeper into Scripture more and better, and to see it in a new and exciting way that maybe we've never seen it before. And so, because I have run over, I want to say, hey, we are officially done. If you want to leave, you can skedaddle and all that kind of stuff. But I do want to open it up for if there's any discussions, any questions, anything like that, if you guys have anything like that.
Pete, I just had a question.
Sure.